Zelo sem vesela, da vas lahko pozdravim v imenu predstavništva Evropske komisije v Sloveniji, v hiši Evropske unije, to se pravi tematsko zelo sovpade z današnjim dogodkom. Noč raziskovalcev Evropska komisija podpira že od leta 2005 in sicer vsako leto septembra se širom Evropske unije in sicer tako v državah članicah kot tudi v državah izven Evropske unije, ki sodelujejo z raziskovalnimi programi, ki komisija podpira, se odvijajo dogodki. Tako kot je bilo rečeno, na današnji dan v več kot 300 mestih po Evropi. Namen vseh teh prireditev je, da se vi, ki delate v različnih raziskovalnih inštitucijah, na fakultetah in tako naprej, da odprete svoje vrata in predstavite svoje aktivnosti na poljuden način in da se tako vrednost, ki jo imajo raziskave in razvoj, predstavijo v najširšem možnem pomenu besede. Vse projekte iz tega programa Noč raziskovalcev komisija tudi finančno podpira. In sicer gre to za finančno podporo iz raziskovalnega programa Obzorje 2020 iz sheme dejavnosti Marijsko-Lvovska kuli. Letos je v okviru programa Noč raziskovalcev prispelo na komisijo več kot 128 prijav, 55 jih je šlo skozi sito, to se pravi, da so bili v najožjem krogu za izbor, in od teh so 3 iz Slovenije. To so humanistika, to si ti, današnja tematika, varni znanostjo ter Noč ima svojo moč. In za omenjenih 55 projektov, ki so bili izbrani, smo na komisiji v letu 2018 in v 2019 namenili 12 milijonov evrov. Lani je na vseh teh prireditvah v okviru Noči raziskovalcev v 342 mestih v Evropi sodelovalo več kot 21.000 raziskovalcev, dogodkov pa se je udeležilo več kot 1.100.000 obiskovalcev. Letos torej prireditve potekajo več kot 300 mestih in upamo, da bodo vsaj tako številčno obiskane kot tudi lani. Obenem sem tudi prepričana, da bo vrvenje znanosti na dogodku, kot je današnji tukaj, kasneje se udeležimo tudi otvoritve v centru mesta in širom Slovenije, da bodo vsi ti dogodki pripomogli tudi k vzbuditvi zanimanja v novih generacijah. Hvala in želim vam uspešen dogodek v naši hiši in dobrodošli v našo hišo tudi na podobne dogodke v prihodnosti.
Hvala za dobilo, pozdrav tako v mojem imenu kot v imenu ministra Pikala, ki je žal danes odsoten v Bruslu, prav na projektih vezanih na obzorja v prihodnosti. Na Ministrstvu za znanost, izobraževanje, znanost in šport, znanost sem skoraj na prvo mesto, verjetno kar z razlogom, pozdravljamo dogodke združene v projekt Evropska noč raziskovalcev, ki znanost približuje in odpira javnosti. Javnost se zaveda in se še vedno bolj mora zavedati pomena znanstvenikov in raziskovalcev za družbo danes in jutri, na kar kažejo v bistvu tudi vedno boljši in vedno navdušeni odzivi, kadar mediji zabeležijo uspehe slovenskih raziskovalk in raziskovalcev. In to lahko z veseljem ugotavljamo, da vedno večkrat najde pot v slovenske medije. Na ministrstvu se zavedamo izjemnega pomena znanosti in raziskov za slovensko družbo. Zato bomo v skupni skrbi za znanost, raziskave in razvoj ustvarjali pogoje za tehnološki in razvojni preboj naše družbe. Da se ustvari pogoji za širši družbeni razvoj in za polno uresničitev Slovenije kot družba znanja. V včerajšnjem delu smo lahko prebrali, da 2/3 gospodarske rasti v Evropski uniji izvira iz raziskav, inovativnosti in znanosti. Tu je tudi ta tako imena konkurenčna prednost Slovenije. Na te odličnosti, raziskovalni in znanstveni odličnosti bomo mi lahko globalno konkurenčni, ne samo kot država, tudi kot Evropska unija, zato so ti projekti še kako pomembni. Ko govorimo o položaju znanosti, raziskav, akademskega sveta v medijih in družbi, pa spomnimo enega drugega pregovora. You're entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your facts. Pravi, ko se danes v medijih pojavljajo različna mnenja, pa se velikrat tudi žal pojavljajo tudi različna dejstva, velika interpretacija tega. Pravimo to z področja narave, družbe ali človeka. In tukaj je ogromna vloga tudi univerze, znanstvenikov, profesorjev, da postavijo stvari na svoje mesto, ker pač ljudje ne morejo imeti različnih mnenj o dejstvih. Hkrati slišimo, da se slovenske raziskovalke in raziskovalce, ko nas opozarjate, kako finančno je podhranjen sistem, zato smo se zavezali, da bomo uredili financiranje. Velika želja našega ministrstva, naše vlade, je, da se zagotovi stabilno, dolgoročno in usmerjeno financiranje raziskav in razvoja. To smo tudi zapisali v koalicijsko pogodbo in naredimo vse v naši moči, da to realiziramo. Čas je, da znanost dobi nov zakon o raziskovalni in razvojni dejavnosti. Vendar ta mora nastati v sodelovanju in v dialogu z deležniki. To bo tudi način, kako upamo, da bomo do tega zakona lahko uspešni. Hkrati tudi načrtujemo revidirati sistem kriterijev kakovosti znanstveno-raziskovalnega dela. In pa, to verjamem, da veliko koga veseli, prav tako nameravamo pohitriti in odpraviti določene administrativne težave in postopke. Zavedati se mora, da vlaganje v izobraževanje in v znanost in v raziskave ni strošek. Je naložba. Naložba v uspešno družbo prihodnosti. Hvala za pozornost.
Spoštovani državni sekretar na Ministrstvu za izobraževanje, znanost in šport, dr. Jernej Štromajer, spoštovana predstavnica za mednarodne povezave in odnose z javnostmi pri Agenciji za raziskovalno dejavnost, gospa Tina Huga, spoštovana namestnica, vodje predstavništva Evropske komisije v Sloveniji, Ula Hudina, spoštovani gostje, dragi kolegice in kolegi. Dovolite, da najprej izrazim zadovoljstvo, hkrati pa tudi olajšanje, da se je Noč raziskovalcev začela. Na Filozofski fakulteti se s tem projektom ukvarjamo že kar nekaj časa in upam, da bodo rezultati našega dela in sodelovanja še številnimi drugimi akterji danes dosegli svoje cilje. V študentskih časih in nekaj časa po diplomi sem kot novinar delal na Radiu Slovenija. Kadarkoli mi je urednica dala nalogo, da za prispevek pridobim izjavo univerzitetnega profesorja ali raziskovalca, sem vedel, da me čaka naporen dan. Prvi problem je bil že v vzpostavitvi kontakta z raziskovalcem. Telefon v pisarni na fakulteti ali na raziskovalnem inštitutu je praviloma zvonil v prazno. S tem ne želim reči, da raziskovalci ne delamo, očitno pa glavnino našega dela, predvsem v družboslovju in humanistiki, opravimo izven naših pisarn. V najboljšem primeru se je na telefonu glasila tajnica, a tudi z njeno pomočjo je bilo težko najti sogovornika. Ko mi je končno le uspelo dogovoriti se za intervju, sem sogovornike pogosto moral prositi, če stvar lahko povejo bolj enostavno, z manj detajli, z manj vrinjenimi stavki, se veste, tako da bodo ljudje razumeli. Leta pozneje sem se sam znašel na drugi strani mikrofona. Ko sem prvič govoril o svojem raziskovalnem delu, se mi je zdelo pomembno omeniti čisto vse. Še več, čisto vsak detalj se mi je zdel enako pomemben in kar naenkrat sem bil sam tisti, ki se ni želel ali ni mogel umestiti v radijski okvir 45 sekund dolgega prispevka. Včasih se mi je potem celo zdelo nesmiselno sodelovati pri takih oddajah, kjer lahko poveš le pol svoje misli, ampak tudi v daljših oddajah in prispevkih se vedno znova pojavlja vprašanje, kako posredovati svoje znanja širšemu občinstvu in kako premostiti prepad med znanstveniki in novinarji. Veseli me, da na začetku letošnje Noči raziskovalcev razmišljamo tudi o tem. Vsem želim uspešen posvet in prijeten dan, ki bo v resnici noč raziskovalcev. Hvala.
Spoštovani državni sekretar na Ministrstvu za izobraževanje, znanost in šport, dr. Štromajer, spoštovana gospa Hudina, spoštovani profesor dr. Kuhar, prominent foreign guests, gospe in gospodje, mnogi znani obrazi danes tukaj z nami. Torej, dovolite, da vas pozdravim v imenu Javne agencije za raziskovalno dejavnost Republike Slovenije in tudi v imenu direktorja, profesor dr. Jožefa Gerkeša, ki je prav v tem trenutku tudi kot minister nekje, on je sicer v zraku, se vrača že iz Bruslja v Ljubljano, kjer pa se tudi dogajajo pomembni premiki s koalicijo S in odprtim dostopom. Torej, naj se zahvalim tudi organizatorjem za povabilo in lepo je biti danes tukaj z vami in lepo je biti del Noči raziskovalcev. Torej, o sami agenciji, čisto na kratko, torej naša vloga in naloga je skrb za stabilno financiranje raziskovalne dejavnosti v Republiki Sloveniji in skrb za dodelitev sredstev prav vsem znanstvenim vedam. Smo torej osrednji financeri sredstev državnega proračuna, In bodri dejstvo, da od leta 2016 vendarle je zaznati povišanje sredstev v primerjavi s tem letom, gre za 12% dvig, zagotovo pa so posledice krčenja sredstev vidne in želimo si, da bi se ta trend nadaljeval, morda zares krepil, kot smo slišali. To me tudi vodi do same tematike današnjega celotnega dneva v celotni Evropi, tudi v navezavi s tem lahko promocija znanosti prispeva veliko. Moramo znati pokazati in razumljivo prikazati javnosti, kaj vse zares neverjetnega se dogaja v naših laboratorijih, na terenu, v trkalnikih, v sodelovanjih po vsem svetu. Torej, slovenska znanost je kakovostna in imamo kaj pokazati. Prav zato Agencija za raziskovalno dejavnost od leta 2014 aktivno spodbuja tudi promocijo znanosti in to počnemo skozi 3 sklope aktivnosti. V okviru prvega sklopa, ki ga imenujemo projekt komuniciranje znanosti, vsako leto prirejamo dneve komuniciranja znanosti, kjer gostimo pomembne, eminentne tuje goste iz tujine. Tako smo gostili urednika časopisa The Guardian, pa uveljavljeno moderatorko in novinarko BBC in Channel 4, v lanskem letu profesorico na MIT in Pulitzerjevo nagrajenko. S tem bomo nadaljevali in trenutno tudi razvijamo koncept satelitskih dogodkov, kjer si želimo naš projekt povezati z iniciativami, ki so zelo aktivne v Sloveniji in to me pravzaprav pelje tudi do drugega sklopa naše podpore. Torej podpiramo odlične inovativne iniciative v Sloveniji v okviru podpore in vzpostavitve in samega razvoja, tako imenovanih inovativnih aktivnosti, promocije slovenske znanosti. Torej v tem okviru podpiramo mnoge med vami, ki vas tudi tukaj danes vidim, znanost, pa Kvarka Dabra, Slovensko tiskovno agencijo, portal Tromba in še kar nekaj inovativnih pilotnih projektov, ki so letos začeli in z veseljem pričakujemo tudi njihove rezultate. Tretja aktivnost je hkrati najstarejša. To je promocija najvidnejših raziskovalnih dosežkov preteklega leta, odlični v znanosti, no te letos dobivajo novo poslanstvo in nov namen. 23. oktobra prirejamo prvi nacionalni dan ARRS in nosilci in nosilke odličnih dosežkov v znanosti bodo predstavljeni v navdih mladim, torej novi generaciji mladih raziskovalcev, ki bo z usposabljanjem začela oktobra. Ne nazadnje, agencija aktivno podpira promocijo znanosti tudi z sodelovanjem v evropskih pobudah. Tako smo bili skupaj z avstrijskimi kolegi, naprimer vključeni tudi v projekt odgovornega raziskovanja in inovacij, RRI-TOOLS, v katerem boste več slišali v nadaljevanju. Torej, spoštovani, dovolite mi, da v imenu agencije in direktorja, da vam zaželim uspešen, ustvarjalen in odmeven dan.
Je Sašo omenil, da pravzaprav je treba opolnomočiti organizacije, spravi raziskovalne inštitute, da začnejo bolj sistematično gojiti veščine komuniciranja. In ravno zato, ker je bila pač priložnost, da o tem malo spregovorim, ker sem sodelovala na projektu RRI-TOOLS, Responsible Research Innovation Tools, skupaj z Tino. Jaz sem bila vključena preko avstrijskega konzorcija, ki ga je vodil Inštitut za socialne kompetence. Se mi je zdela ta priložnost idealna, da o tem spregovorim, da se vedno ne pogovarjamo samo o medijih in da se vedno ne pogovarjamo samo o osebnih kompetencah znanstvenikov, pač pa da mogoče to debato res malo razvijamo tudi na ostale deležnike. Zato, ker imamo nekaj tujih gostov, je prezentacija v angleščini, upam, da vas to ne moti, govorila pa bom v slovenščini. Torej, zakaj inštitucije res potrebujejo opolnomočiti svoje ključne kadre? Se pravi, to je ne samo raziskovalce individualno, ali pa da to počnejo samo tisti, ki jih to veseli, osebno, ki pač imajo to željo o svoji znanosti govoriti, pisati, pripovedovati, to je pravzaprav, to več ne sme biti neka ljubiteljska dejavnost posameznih raziskovalcev. To mora postati res razumevanje na resnem nivoju vodstvenih kadrov, ključnih raziskovalcev v institucijah. Gre za to, da se zlasti v času, ko je bilo, recimo po krizi, ko je bilo manj sredstev za znanost, se je kar naenkrat vzpostavilo, pa ne samo v Sloveniji, v celi Evropi, vprašanje, kaj pa znanost lahko naredi za družbo, kaj pa imamo mi od znanosti, skratka, kje pa sploh znanost je. In ni čudno, da je ta kriza pravzaprav zelo vzniknila te debate o umeščanju znanstvenih tem v naše vsakdanje življenje, o tem storytellingu, o katerem vam bom več povedal kolega Alok. Skratka, gre za to, da je treba znati vzpostavljati tudi ta dialog, pa ne samo z laično javnostjo. Mimogrede, tudi politiki so laična javnost. Ampak gre za vzpostavljati dialog, se pravi pogovor, se pravi agree to disagree včasih, ne? Z ljudmi, ki ustvarjajo politike, z industrijo. Tukaj ni nujno, da je recimo industrija, kljub temu, da so tam zaposleni raziskovalci na istem nivoju ali pa da je ta dialog enakovreden kot recimo z raziskovalci, ki delujejo v raziskovalnih institucijah. Skratka, ta dialog je resnično zelo dragocen in v resnici družba ga potrebuje. Tudi, bom rekla, politiki ga potrebujejo za to, da utemeljijo tudi svoje argumente, za to, da se znanost postavi na neko pravo mesto iz vidika družbe. Mimogrede, prej v odmoru smo se pogovarjali z dekanom Filozofske fakultete. Poslanstvo je res pomembno. Gasilci pa znanstveniki so med najbolj zaupni, dva poklica, katerim Slovenci najbolj zaupajo. In to zaupanje je potrebno utemeljevati, oziroma ga je potrebno utrjevati. Torej, ampak potem se vprašamo, ali se raziskovalne institucije res zavedajo, da je to njihovo poslanstvo. 3 leta nazaj je bil v Sloveniji Dani Šepman, on je Nobelov nagrajen za kemijo in on je povedal v Odmevih, je bil gost Igorja Berganta in povedal je, da čisto vsak raziskovalec mora biti sposoben komunicirati z laično javnostjo. In na to vedno Igor Bergant spomne in zato je to ena taka istočnica, ko se pogovarjamo o medijih, je to vedno, ja, ampak sej, morate znati, se o svoji znanosti pogovarjati, to približati. Ampak, a to in se institucije zavedajo raziskovalne, a krepijo te kompetence komunikacijske? Kako, ali recimo zdaj, oprostite, bomo vzela ta primer trenutno Filozofske fakultete, v kateri se pravi ta nepravilnost financiranja oziroma pač postopkov in pač ta, bom rekla, neprijetna situacija, hkrati pa noč raziskovalcev. In je prav, da Filozofska fakulteta komunicira in je ta noč raziskovalcev pravzaprav odlična priložnost, da se pove, da se ne more zreducirati delo tolikih raziskovalcev samo na eno afero. To je, institucije so proces, dogaja se vse živo, dogaja pa se tudi raziskovanje. In ob tem, ko se poudarjajo pozitivni učinki humanistike, družboslovja v našem primeru, ne, in s temi dogodki, se na nek način tudi predstavi javnosti, da se dogajajo pozitivne stvari v znanosti in da znanost je pomembna. Ko se pa pogovarjam z posameznimi znanstveniki, je pa na individualnem nivoju je pa kar velik strah prisoten v tem smislu, kot ste povedali, vi prej v vašem govoru, kaj pa, če me bodo narobe razumeli, kaj pa, če me bodo napačno interpretirali. To je vse možno in to je vse, so pravi razmisleki, vendar so tudi raziskovalne organizacije odgovorne, da razbremenijo raziskovalce z novim znanjem. Kot rečeno, umaknila bi se od individualnih raziskovalcev, umaknila bi se od medijev, In rada bi povedala nekaj, rada bi povedala malo več o enem naboru orodij, komunikacijskih orodij, ki je bil zbran v projektu, to je bil flagship projekt Evropske unije, imenoval se Responsible Research Innovation Tools, www.rri-tools.eu ali .com, org, sam nekaj tacka. V tem projektu, ki sta ga koordinirale španska Caixa in University College London, to je bil konzorcij 26 organizacij. In že od samega začetka je bil proces zelo participativno se pravi zastavljen. Dobili smo se najprej, da smo sploh identificirali, na kakšen način in s katerimi deležniki in kaj pravzaprav neznanstveno poslanstvo posamezne raziskovalne institucije. Zato, da smo raziskali, kaj so naše neznanstvene vrednote, se pravi, kaj bi radi sporočili javnosti, potem koga nagovarjamo, katere deležnike nagovarjamo, kdo je za nas zanimiv, kdo je za ene raziskovalne institucije zanimiv in kaj so ta orodja, ki bi jih radi razvili. In potem je šel proces spet zelo participativno, skratka zelo bottom-up, identificirali smo po posameznih državah in tukaj je bila tudi vključena Slovenija. Na ARRS je pripravil 2 delavnice na to temo, da smo zbrali najboljše prakse komuniciranja v okviru znanstvenih institucij in potem smo iz tega naredili in potem ta orodja so se nabirala glede na kriterije, glede na deležnike, glede na cilje in glede na vsebine. Bilo je zbrano več kot 300 dogodkov, več kot 300 orodij v veliki platformi, vam bom potem pokazala, in to je bil v bistvu tak proces. Najprej smo pogledali, kaj so pač te vrednote, ki so neznanstvene vrednote, ki bi jih radi komunicirali, se pravi, kdo so naši ključni deležniki in kaj so pač te ključne tematike, okrog katerih se vrtijo orodja, komunikacijska orodja tega projekta. In ko greš ti na spletno stran, te spletna stran zelo vodi, hvala lepa, se je tako pravzaprav zelo lažje, te spletna stran zelo vodi, odkot prihajaš in potem lahko izbiraš nabor teh orodij. In ravno zato, ker bi se res danes rada izognila tem komunikacijam na nivoju medijev in individualni komunikacijski odličnosti, sem zbrala 3 primere, ki so bili predstavljeni, se pravi, ki so bili zabeleženi kot primeri dobre prakse, so zabeleženi v tem RRI Tools, v tem skladišču orodij in ki so pravzaprav namenjeni drugim, ne medijem. Skratka, gre za projekt, ki se imenuje Explore Health, namenjen je pa financer oziroma avtor tega projekta je ta španska Caixa, to je največja španska fundacija za znanost, privatna, podobno kot Wellcome Trust na podoben način deluje. In to je spletna stran, orodje za zelo veliko materiala in vsebin, edukativnih platform vsebin, prav za učitelje. Se pravi, to je orodje, ki ga Caixa, IRSI Caixa, pa Obra Social Caixa, ki ga namenjajo učiteljem za opolnomočenje učenja biotehnologije, to so različne vsebine, različni konteksti, različni researchi, ob tem, da so podprti z multimedijskimi viri. Se pravi, na ta način v bistvu se lahko podpre učitelje na področju biotehnologije, da izvajajo tako imenovano komunicirane znanosti. Drug primer je spet namenjen gimnazijcem in sicer ta primer je namenjen, kako lahko znanstveniki v raziskovalnih institucijah pomagajo odpirati različne debate zato, da vključujejo študente, gimnazijce, tiste, ki razmišljajo o izbiri študija na različne teme. In konkretno ta primer vključuje ne samo naravoslovne, pač pa tudi ostale humanistične študije o vplivu barv, o vplivu, recimo konkretno tukaj spodaj je pač konkretno promocija enega orodja, namenjenega znanstvenikom, kako lahko recimo preko barv, kar pomeni tudi različnost, in začnejo diskusije na temo znanosti iz različnih disciplin. No, ta zadnji primer je pa zanimiv primer, kako v bistvu kako lahko ta primer pa opisuje, na kaj je treba biti pozoren in na kaj je treba biti pozoren, ko se razvijajo programi ICT, se pravi računalniška podjetja oziroma sem se malo zapletla, se opravičujem, ko se razvijajo programi oziroma aplikacije, računalniške aplikacije za starajočo se populacijo. To so pripravile raziskovalne institucije, namenjene je mladim podjetjem, se pravi start-upom, vsem tistim, ki razvijajo programska orodja za starejše ljudi. Se pravi, imamo spet cel splet enih zelo kakovostnega orodja za komuniciranje se pravi, zelo na nek način na nivoju raziskovalna institucija in biznis, se pravi podjetja. No in če na podlagi teh parih primerov, kaj bi zdaj lahko recimo rekli, kje pa zdaj začnemo tukaj, ali pa kje pa smo v Sloveniji, ali pa kako pa zdaj, ko jaz pridem v mojo pisarno, kako pa zdaj od jutra naprej, ne? V bistvu je v to, in tukaj v bistvu pozivam vse, ki imate to moč, ki ste na teh pozicijah, da lahko to počnete, treba je vključiti v te debate res vodilne na raziskovalnih institucijah. Ne rečem, da se vsi tega ne zavedajo, ampak zavedati bi se mogli pa še bolj. Treba je podpreti tiste znanstvenike, ki so pripravljeni, ki imajo energijo, ki jih to veseli, da se s tem ukvarjajo. Treba je ustvariti notranjo zavedanje in potem narediti res zelo strokovn mapping, kdo so tisti deležniki, s katerimi komuniciramo, ker ni vse za skomunicirati z vsemi. To so tudi različne poglobljene, različno globino ali pa različne vsebine določenim deležnikom je treba predstavljati. Treba je izobraževati raziskovalce, ampak ne samo jih izobraževati na temo, kako nastopati v javnosti. Seveda, to je nujno potrebno, ampak so tudi druge finese. Znanstveniki imajo različne ambicije, na kateri bi se bolj vidijo v raziskovalnem delu z podjetji in njih je treba opolnomočiti. Potem nekateri se vidijo bolj v tem, da znajo z mediji komunicirati, treba njih opolnomočiti. Nekatere je treba bolj vključiti v edukacijski proces. Vemo, da se generacije zmanjšujejo in je treba tudi mlade navduševati za znanstveno-raziskovalno delo. Tudi, če se ne odločijo za ta poklic v nadaljevanju, jih ta izkušnja raziskovanja zelo lahko opolnomoči in obogati za celo življenje. In treba je ustvarjati zgodbe in treba se je naučiti te zgodbe kontekstualizirati. O tem bo pa več povedal moj kolega Alok v nadaljevanju.
Water. Well, so I wrote on water because I'm obsessed with strange things, and water is incredibly strange, and it doesn't follow any of the rules of chemistry. It's bizarre, and the strangest thing about it, I suppose, is that we all think of it as completely boring and everyday and normal, but it is actually the strangest thing in the entire universe, and that's why I wanted to explore why.
So, Thank you very much. I will give the floor now to your presentation, and I hope we all enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jadranka. Thank you all for the invitation here. It's really nice to see you. I'm a journalist, as Jadranka said, and I'm here to talk to you about, I suppose, my experience in science journalism and how that can maybe translate into some ideas and thoughts for scientists and experts who want to communicate to wider publics. So one thing you'll notice about me is that I do very bad PowerPoint presentations. This is not the best because I don't really like PowerPoint presentations, if I'm honest, but I feel like it's something that everyone has to do these days. So I put this together a little while ago, and it's the most basic thing you'll ever see, but I think it gets some of the ideas across. So I call this good and bad science communication. And by science communication, I think I include science journalism, but I think they're slightly different things. But in general, how to talk to people about something that they may not be interested in, how to talk to people about something that's complicated, that's what I want to try and get across today. So my subtitle for this talk is basically how to stop boring people, because ultimately the science, we want to tell people stories and inform them about things, but many of us who are experts end up convincing the members of the public that what we do actually is quite dull, because we want to give you all the information and all the details, and that's not how to do it. The other version of this talk that I sometimes talk about is called How to Tell a Story, because ultimately storytelling is the most important part of all communication. So, just a little bit about me. As I've been introduced already, I'm a journalist, and I've covered science and technology and medicine for many, many places. Mostly for the Guardian newspaper for about 12 years, and then for the BBC and ITV in the UK, to major TV channels, and for radio as well. And so I've kind of covered all the different media in terms of how you cover complex science stories. And also I've written 3 books. The water book being the last one, which you just heard a tiny snippet of. Water is something that is really as bizarre as I've said it is. And if you don't know that, you might find the book interesting. So let me start by describing what I think science is, and which I hope that as this audience you will also agree what science might be. Well, first of all, science is very objective and detached. Well, that's the aim anyway. It's not always like that, but the idea is it's meant to be a way of understanding and appreciating the world that is objective and dispassionate. There are many, many shades of grey. So you discover something in a scientific idea, and it's never fact. It's just the best you can do with the evidence that you have at that point. I think we'll agree. By the way, if you disagree with any of this, just please put your hand up and say. Science contains lots and lots of probabilities and likelihoods. Nothing is ever certain. You're trained as a scientist to understand that. You're understanding that this is the best possible version of the truth I have at this moment, but if something else comes along, evidence that shows something different, then you'll change your mind. That's fine. And again, that walks into something about certainty. There is no such thing as certainty in science. You can get to almost certainty, but you're always leaving the door open for something new. And that's fine. That's how you're trained to believe the world. So what's storytelling? Storytelling is what you think it is. It's not anything, I'm not going to tell you anything magical here. You do it all the time. You do it to your friends and your family. If someone ever asks you, what have you been up to today? What happened on that holiday over there? Any of these questions, you tell a story. You start at the beginning, something happens, and it ends. That's just what storytelling is. It's a very natural, human way of communicating. It's personal, it's subjective, it's about you, it's about the things around you. It's full of anecdotes about things that happen to you. It's simple, it's unnuanced. So if something happens, you want to try and explain something quickly and to get you from one point to the next. You don't need to think about any of these things, of course. You just do them automatically when we're telling stories. Think of any fairy tales. They have the same structure. Any good films, they have the same structure. They don't have too much detail. They just go from one place to another. It allows you to just stay within the story for the whole time. There are lots of judgments of right and wrong in stories, safe and unsafe. In the real world, someone asks you, is this thing safe? You say yes or no. You don't say, well, 75% chance it could be safe. That's just not how normally we communicate with the world, with each other. You make decisions based on right and wrong every single day, on all sorts of things. So in a way, you can see that science and storytelling are very different things. They're in fact completely the opposite of each other. So how do you begin to put these things together? Well, before I go into it, let me give you some examples of what I think are the bad ways of doing this. You've probably all got your own examples of bad storytelling, bad science communication. But here are a few of mine. The MMR and autism story. I don't know how much of it you know here, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, a doctor in the UK published a series of case studies in the Lancet medical journal, linking some kids with autism with a triple vaccine, MMR. And initially, no one really took notice. There was a press conference in which the doctor, Andrew Wakefield, said he linked these two things, MMR and autism. And obviously, people in the audience started to worry about what this meant for their children. And it became a huge story, to the point where even today, certain parts of the UK, and certain parts of Europe even, the MMR vaccine uptake rates are low. And measles is coming back in some parts of the country, some parts of the continent rather. These bad bits of science communication have real impact on people's lives. People die, people get ill. I mean, this whole issue of vaccine safety has become an issue since then and all over the world. And it's all based around very bad science and very, very much worse science communication. Another example is, again, the UK example, late 1990s, the UK government and scientists there wanted to introduce genetically modified crops to the country. And this was a technology that was still developing, but had lots of promise. And there was lots of promise for making plants resistant to various diseases, or putting extra nutritional value into plants. None of this was proven, of course, but the scientific method is to try things out and see what works. But lots and lots of environmental groups in the UK decided that this was dangerous to human health, dangerous to the environment. They may have had their reasons, but they caused huge amounts of media coverage, and journalists sort of took it on board as well. Many, many journalists reported terrible stories about GM crops. The phrase Frankenfoods came along, which is Frankenstein foods. The idea that you would put genes from one creature into another, into a plant, it horrified people. It wasn't true, of course, but it horrified people. It meant that during that time that GM crops could have become a significant industry in the UK, they never arrived. And to this day, in the UK, and in fact most of Europe, GM crops are just not planted anywhere because of these sorts of environmental concerns. And I would say because of bad science communication. In the rest of the world, they're everywhere. And one personal, final thing that I hate more than anything else, and is terrible, is anything that promises you a breakthrough in health, because every single press release or scientist who talks about some cure of something they found in a lab dish or in a mouse that promises a breakthrough in the future, we know that most of them will never actually come to anything. But because people want coverage, they promise these breakthroughs, and many incredulous journalists will just cover it. I'm sure it annoys you as well. It annoys me. Anything with a cure just around the corner, I just never believe. And in fact, the words breakthrough and future cure have lost all meaning for me. So what's good examples of science communication? going to show you these, and then maybe we can tease out some examples and commonalities between them to see what can we learn from them. I think one of the best examples of good science communication is the Large Hadron Collider. Now, do you all know what the Large Hadron Collider is? Mm-hmm. Does anyone not know? Okay, so you all know. The Large Hadron Collider is a particle accelerator in Geneva, and it's a huge international project to try and understand the fabric of the universe. One of the most ambitious goals of science in the 20th and 21st century. The Large Hadron Collider was built to do many, many things, but one of the very first things it was built to do was to complete the standard model of particle physics. So the standard model describes all the particles and forces that exist. It's been built over 50 years in the late 20th century. But there's one piece missing, which was the Higgs boson, which was this particle that explains why everything has mass in the universe. And so they needed to find this thing to prove that this standard model is true. And so they needed a big particle accelerator to smash particles together, to look at what was inside, to find one of these particles. I mean, in a sense, this is all meaningless. I mean, why does this matter to any of us? I'm a physicist by background, but even I couldn't really understand the purpose of it beyond the fact that it just cost a lot of money and it looked quite nice, right? I didn't understand what these guys were doing. No one else did, but this gets coverage all the time in newspapers, and it's always generally positive. And fundamentally, these people can explain to you, they give you the newspapers will give them the time and the space to talk about deep quantum physics and particle physics every single day. All of this came to a head, by the way, in 2012. So this is the Large Hadron Collider, and this is a joke which no one's going to get. But I call it the Large Hadron Collider with this typeface. Does anyone know what this typeface is? No? So, this is called Comic Sans. It's a typeface which is used in comics, in fact. And it's kind of a joke typeface. No one serious uses this, except for Fabiola Gianotti, who is the head of the ATLAS collaboration, one of the big science experiments at the Large Hadron Collider. She was the chief scientist for one of the big experiments. She's the director general. But she presented in 2012 the discovery of the Higgs boson to the world using a presentation using the Comic Sans, which is a kid's typeface, by the way, which no serious human being should be using. But obviously, one of the most important and impressive scientists in the world using it, you pay attention. So here it is. Here's her presentation, the beginning of it. Here's all the various scientific results and this thing here, whatever that means, and then the title, and all the different bits of the experiment, all the models. I have no idea what any of this means. Neither does the world, by the way. But this was live streamed on the CERN website on July 4th, 2012. When they were announcing all this. And this live stream was so widely watched around the world. I mean, about 6 people in the world understood what any of this meant. But the millions of people logged onto this live stream to the extent that the live stream didn't work for most people. It fell over. I remember I was in The Guardian at the time, and I was blogging, and I was trying to watch it. I couldn't access the whole thing because so many people wanted to watch it. Of course, CERN being the place that invented the World Wide Web, you'd think they'd do better web connections, but they just don't. Anyway, so the Large Hadron Collider allowed us as journalists and scientists in this field to talk about particle physics for years and years and years, and it continues to do so in a way that is warm, inviting, complicated, but really, really good. They bring people in. When the Large Hadron Collider was switched on in 2008 or 9, there were newspaper articles in the UK, in some newspapers, that were concerned that one of the things this was going to do was create small black holes that would swallow the Earth up. And so everyone was concerned, well, not everyone, but these people were concerned, and they put it on the front pages of the newspapers that scientists are building this experiment that could destroy the whole world. And it was on the front page. And so the traditional view from scientists 10 years ago in the UK would have been, oh my God, this is ridiculous, I'm not even going to engage with this. And in fact, that's what people in the genetically modified back in 1999, when genetically modified crops were being covered very badly, whenever we used to ask scientists to sort of say, look, can you tell us some good things about these technologies, or to rebut some of these nonsense claims? Many scientists would say to us in newspapers, they say, listen, no, I'm not going to get involved in this conversation because if the public wants to know about GM crops, they'll just go and read the scientific journals themselves. And I thought no one will read the scientific journals. Not even most scientists read the scientific journals. Never mind the fact that they're not available to the public anyway because of paywalls. So the Large Hadron Collider, the day it was switched on in 2008, were all these stories about the world being destroyed. And so the physicists at the Large Hadron Collider, instead of getting angry about it, what they did was to speak to those journalists and anyone else who would phone in and use it as an opportunity to say, no, that's not going to happen. But what we are trying to do is this. And it allowed those people who were concerned, for right or wrong, allowed them to speak to physicists, learn a bit more about the Standard Model. It was good. And it continues to this day to be one of the best examples of how to talk about science to the public. My next example is the Rosetta mission, the European Space Agency's mission to land on a comet. Again, I'm assuming most of you know about this one. The Rosetta mission was a probe sent by the European Space Agency to catch up with a comet and then land something on the comet and send back some of the first samples from the surface of the comet, some of the first pictures. And so the lander was called Philae, and here it is. This is the Rosetta. That's Philae, the little lander. And what I love about this one was that they thought very hard. The European Space Agency does do very well with talking about its science to people because people generally have a sort of soft spot for space, I think, but they did specifically well with this one because they thought very hard how they were going to make this relevant to people from a storytelling perspective. What they did, for example, was to give each of these things characters. So this was a comic they produced on a regular basis in the years running up to the experiment. So there's Philae, there's little Philae on top of Rosetta there, and these things had characters. It took 10 years for Rosetta from launch to get to the comet. So they had 10 years worth of communication to do to keep people interested. And then on the actual day that the lander was going to land on the comet, the world's media came to Darmstadt in Germany, to the European Space Agency Control Center, to watch what was happening. Now, the idea was that this lander would land, it would send back these pictures, in itself an incredible piece of engineering. And then for the next few months, the lander would do experiments on the surface of the comet and send back information. What ended up happening was slightly different because it did catch up with the comet. The lander did land, but then for several hours they couldn't understand why the lander hadn't communicated back, and they thought perhaps it was lost. Eventually, it did contact the Earth, but what was going on was that the lander, instead of landing flat, it landed at an angle, which meant that the solar panels weren't facing the sun, which meant that within 2 days the battery power would run out. So for 2 days, the whole world was fascinated by what was going on the surface of this comet, millions and millions of miles away. During that whole time, the European Space Agency had given each of these space probes a Twitter account. The Twitter accounts would talk to each other about what they were doing. Huge amounts of detail about the science, the pictures, the experiments that were going on. And also there was a story because after 2 days, Philae, the lander, was going to run out of batteries. It was going to die basically on that comet. People were so obsessed with this story. I remember I was covering it for the TV news at the time. We led the 3 news bulletins a day on this for 3 days. People who aren't interested in science were just wondering what this probe was doing on the surface. I think some genuinely believed that it had a mind and a brain of its own. It was getting worried about how it was going to run out of power. Basically, it was a character. It was a story. They cared about this character and they cared about what it was doing. So Rosetta and Philae, I think, are another really good example of great science communication. And one final quick one was human-animal hybrids. Now, this is a bit more complicated in that in the late 2000s, when scientists were looking for ways of growing human embryonic stem cells, there were lots and lots of ethical issues around using human material for any research, of course, as it should be. And the supply of human eggs is very low. But you need those humans in order to extract stem cells for research. So scientists came up with a different mechanism for getting these things, which is that they would create stem cells by taking human nuclei, essentially, putting them into the eggs of mice, rabbits, I think, actually, and then to create what was called a hybrid embryo between two different species, and then using that to grow the cells up and then extract stem cells from there for research. And to allow this to happen, of course, in the UK, we needed to have regulation. And so that meant that Parliament had to vote on whether this was going to be allowed or not. Now, there were lots and lots of pressure groups in the UK, religious groups and others, who thought that this was still not a great thing to do. This was unethical because of for their own concerns. And so there was lots of campaigning going on both sides. Now, 10 years earlier, when genetically modified crops were on the about to be introduced into the UK, the environmental and ethical groups really won that argument because they swamped the scientists, and the scientists didn't really respond. The scientists have learned their lesson though, and in 2009, when this debate came along, what scientists did was quite impressive. They spoke to pretty much groups of them would go and speak to members of Parliament, and I think almost every single member of Parliament received a briefing individually from scientists to say, look, this is what this technology is, this is what we know about it, this is what we don't know about it, this is why we want to do it. We want to do it in order to understand, human diseases, to potentially find new cures for things, to understand things like dementia. We need to have stem cells. We need to understand how stem cells work. They explained all of this, and then essentially let parliamentarians decide what to do with that information. And because of that active engagement over the course of several years, the active engagement not only with scientists, but not only with parliamentarians, but with the media, treating those audiences as intelligent people who just don't have the information that perhaps they need to make the decisions. As long as you treat them with respect, which the scientists did in this case, the result was that when the parliamentarians went to vote, they overwhelmingly voted to support hybrid embryos, which means that the UK became the first country in the world to officially allow this kind of research with the right regulations in the country, which is, I think, a good, successful result. As it happened, science sometimes takes over in terms of what you can and can't do. We don't really need human hybrid embryos anymore because it's much, much easier to create stem cells using other very non-controversial techniques now. But the point was that this is a really interesting, useful example of successful science communication. So, what can you learn from those examples of what I would call good science communication? The one thing that I would say is that none of this is easy. It's not easy to talk about complicated things to people who haven't had the training to understand it, and also who probably aren't interested in the moment you're telling them. So there are a lot of things going on in terms of what you can do to get people to come onto your side. If you're focused on one thing in your career as a scientist, like you're focused on one aspect of the cell's division, or how one particular molecule works in a material, it's very hard to zoom out and remember what it's like to not know that thing. To remember what it's like not to know all of these training methods you have in your head to understand the world. And I think often scientists, and all experts for that matter, are so focused on what they've done for so long, they don't see the structures and the learning they've done to get to the point where they are. They expect people who haven't had any training in this to suddenly just come and believe what they're saying, without any sort of attempt to sort of understand that non-expert's view. So my first thing is that, my first sort of tip out of all of this is that science is an inherently good thing, I believe. It's trying to make the world a better place. And so you should own that as an expert, as a scientist. And the examples I gave you, one thing that's in common with all of them is that they're all about making the world a better place in some way, whether it's through inspiration or whether it's through health or whatever else. And so you have a good story to tell. So the first thing you want to do is be authentic. You are an expert in something, so you should own that expertise. You have something to say, which is not the case for many people who want to be in the media, to be honest. You have something to say, so you should be authentic. My second thing is, of course, to tell a story, which is that actually we don't, in the normal world, communicate in the way that scientists communicate with each other. Scientists communicate with each other through papers, through statistics and numbers, but it's taken you a long time as a scientist to understand how to do that, to learn how to do that, for that to become natural to you. Most of the world doesn't communicate like this. So when you step out of your world into, say, the rest of the world, storytelling is the way that you tell anyone anything. Whether it's literally what you did today at work, or whether it's a fairy tale. Storytelling is one of my colleagues who is a professional storyteller, works a lot with scientists. She says this. She does a lot of research into why stories matter to people, why stories go into the brain in a much quicker way than just if I tell you a load of facts. And what it is, she says, what psychologists find is that stories are a very human way of communicating because they have a sort of almost like a preferential cognitive pathway. As soon as you start telling a story to someone, they start to listen. If you start to list information, they stop listening. I always tell people not to dumb things down. There's a reason why science is important and works. It's because it's about complexity and detail. And so if you respect your audience and they respect you, you have the permission to tell them things that are complicated. Now you might need to tell them things that are complicated in a very structured and safe and slow way, but you don't need to make things wrong or dumb things down to the point where there's no detail in what you're saying at all. You've got to assume that your audience is intelligent, I think, but not yet informed on the particular topic you're talking about. And my former editor at The Guardian would always say this, and he, by the way, he was a science editor at The Guardian for 30 years before he retired, he always used to say, you should never underestimate your audience's intelligence, but you should never overestimate their knowledge. No one is able to understand anything, you just take them through it step by step. Don't assume everything. Don't include everything. And if you, again, going back to my point of, you've studied something for decades to the point where you are the expert, probably the world's expert, in one particular thing. And so it's very natural when you want to talk to people about that thing that you want to take everyone on that same journey with you that you've had for 20 years to understand all the ins and outs and the ups and downs and the cut and weave everything, so that they understand that thing in the same way that you. Unfortunately, you don't have 30 years to talk to that person. Maybe you do, I don't know. But you probably won't have that many years. So you can't include everything. So you have to edit, and that means allowing, therefore, you can. But editing is a good thing because it allows you to shape your message and do things more quickly. But it also allows the person you're telling to then ask more questions. And ultimately, that's what you want them to do. The worst thing in the world is telling people loads of things and then going, okay, and walking off again. What you want is to spark an interest, and for that person to ask more questions, get interested and pull information out of you. Again, another thing that my former editor used to say to me, and it stuck to my brain, which is, you may feel obliged to tell people about your work, but nobody is obliged to listen to you, ever. I think you have to earn people's time and attention. You do that through respecting them, and respecting their time, respecting their knowledge, respecting the way that they see the world. You have to earn that. Every single sentence that you tell somebody, if it works, you can earn another sentence to tell them. That's how I see it. So, that's don't include everything. The next one, don't insult your reader. Now, by this I mean, if a lot of science communicators about 10 years ago started doing this thing where they would talk about science to the public, and then if people said, oh, well, I don't believe that, I don't believe in evolution, or I think that the world is flat. Instead of saying, okay, that's interesting, and I don't agree with you, many of my colleagues would say, oh my God, you're so stupid. You're so stupid. Why would you believe that? Like, why would you think that? I mean, I'm not even engaged with this. You're all dumb. And there was a bit of a culture war going on between these sides. Now, the only result of that is that you might feel better as a science communication person or a scientist to go, oh my God, stupid people. But it just entrenches the opposite view too. So you feel better for being clever, and they just feel insulted, and they will probably entrench in their view because they just think, oh my God, this stupid person is making me feel stupid. If you want to persuade someone of something, anything, whether it's science or anything else, the worst thing you can do is to insult the person to begin with, because why would they listen to you? It's just a sort of normal human interaction, right? But we sort of forget this sometimes when talking about science, because we've all got used to the fact that science is correct and is a really good way of seeing the world, as in it's a useful way of seeing the world. It allows us to build a better world and make predictions. But not everyone sees that. But we sometimes we'll get into this evangelical mode of like, if you're not with us, you're against us, which I think is counterproductive to the whole enterprise. So, you might think at this point. Does anyone have any questions at this point? So you might think at this point, well, this is all very obvious, and why? I'm sure this is all useful. And many scientists at different stages of their careers will come across these sorts of issues. And what do I?
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah.
Very nice discussion and very nice talk. I wonder how can we communicate with the children? Sometimes we have presentations for children from school. What will be the level of simplicity you suggest?
Well, it depends on the children. So I think that if you've got children who are interested in science and read lots about it, and I mean, I find that if you speak to school kids that are interested in science, they don't really let you speak very much. They ask lots of questions, and so you don't have to do much. You will very quickly get a sense of what they want to know. And if something's too complicated, they just ask more questions. And I think that's one set of kids, and not everyone's like that, of course. That's one set, and so then it's very easy to understand what they want to know. But from a more general sense of what level to go at, it just depends on how old they are, and kind of, it's always worth speaking to teachers about what they already know. In a sense, speaking to kids is easy because they are interested, and like I said, they'll ask questions if they don't know. The harder thing is speaking to people who are adults who don't know anything about science, in a way, because you don't know what they know, first of all, but also many people who aren't interested won't even betray that. They don't want to look stupid, so they won't say anything at all. And so the level I would pitch to, I would say, a general audience who I don't know anything about is probably, let's say, that's really hard. It really depends on what the audience is, but I would say an interested teenager, basically. Someone who's interested in the world but hasn't had much access to information yet. And when it comes to children, I mean, the things that they most respond to, the youngest children, the things that people I find most respond to are things like space and dinosaurs, and that can work, and that's quite interesting and fun. We don't have to be talking to them about scientific method at that point, I don't think. But I'm not sure I've answered your question. I've never really had to do many conversations with little kids and things, because frankly, you don't have to, as I said, you don't actually do much talking. They just do the talking for you, and then you just point them towards information. But I think that if you're interested in knowing exactly what level to pitch, I think always talk to the teachers who are involved, because they will know what these kids know and what they don't know. Any other questions at this point? No? I'll say one more thing then before I finish up. So these are sort of some lessons one can learn from good science communication. You might be saying, this is all obvious. You get this, but why bother? I mean, why bother with any of this? there's the obvious thing, which is that people should know about scientific research. It's good for their knowledge of the world. It's good for the public sort of license to operate that scientists have. Scientists in the world don't operate in a vacuum. Money comes from the government mostly, and so governments can be fickle. If they decide one year that science research is not something that they're interested in, they could just decide not to fund it. It's unlikely, but they can decide not to fund it. And the only reason that you're protected is if the public gives you a license to operate and gives you that sense that actually this is something important. And if you, as a politician, decide not to fund it, there'll be some sort of outcry. The example I gave you before. So in the UK, politically, our health service is something that everyone loves, hugely underfunded. But if you try to cut any funding to the health service ever, basically politicians are attacked from every side. And whether that's right or wrong, the point is that people have a huge amount of love and kind of a sort of personal connection with the health service, and so it never gets any funding cuts, hardly. The Large Hadron Collider is basically the same. People don't know what it does, but because it's so popular in the media, if anyone ever suggested we shouldn't fund particle physics, there will be a huge outcry in the public press. And it protects it. It protects that fundamental work from the whims of politics. Now that's one reason to have your work out there and be useful to people. But I think that there's something really important now. We live in a time, especially the last few years, where there's so much information, so much good information and bad information, that science and scientific information and scientific thoughts and ideas are becoming even more important than ever. And unless people who are intellectual and interested in the world and have rational ideas are speaking and being out there, talking about their work, I feel like we're going to get subsumed by nonsense. We're just going to get completely subsumed by it. All that nonsense is going to be out there, and no one else is going to be there challenging it all the time. So my argument to all of this is not just to save yourselves and give your science to the people out there, it's to fight. It's basically we're in a fight right now for rationality in the whole of the world. And it's up to people like you, people like us I guess as well, as journalists, to make sure that in amongst this tide of rubbish and nonsense that's out there in the world, that there's good information out there as well. So what makes good science communication? It's all of these things that I said before. Be authentic, tell a story, don't dumb things down, don't assume interest, don't include everything, don't insult your reader, and of course, you've got to fight.